James Collins came home with flowers, hoping to mend a fractured marriage. Rebecca Collins came home with a gun, ready to change everything forever. What really happened behind the closed doors of their quiet suburban life to anyone watching? From the outside, James and Rebecca Collins seemed to have built the kind of life most people only dreamed of. Their house sat on a quiet, tree-lined street in Charleston, South Carolina, modest but beautiful, with white shutters, a wraparound porch, and a manicured garden that James prided himself on. Every Saturday morning, he could be seen outside wearing his old baseball cap, pruning the rose bushes or planting new seasonal flowers, always humming to himself as if life had settled into a peaceful rhythm. Rebecca, graceful and composed, was usually returning from her early morning jog, just as James finished with the garden, and the two would exchange a wave and disappear into the house where the smell of pancakes or scrambled eggs often drifted through the windows. James worked as a high school math teacher. He was well liked by his students and respected by his colleagues. Known for his gentle demeanor and dry sense of humor, he kept a bowl of peppermints on his desk and would slip a piece to any student who seemed anxious before a test. Rebecca was a nurse at a local urgent care clinic. Her co-workers described her as dependable, calm under pressure, and deeply compassionate. The couple had no children, but they doted on their golden retriever, Max, who had his own Instagram account, and often appeared in snapshots of beach trips, holiday decorations, and lazy Sunday afternoons on the couch. To friends and neighbors, James and Rebecca were the picture of contentment. They hosted small dinner parties with wine and board games. On Halloween, they handed out full-sized candy bars. Every Christmas, James strung up twinkling lights with care, climbing a ladder while Rebecca stood below, ready to catch him if he lost his balance. They celebrated their 5th wedding anniversary quietly, with dinner at their favorite seafood restaurant and a late-night walk along the pier. When they returned home, James gave Rebecca a bouquet of red tulips, her favorite flower. She smiled for the camera as he took a photo, her eyes bright, his hand resting on the small of her back. But photographs can lie, or rather, they can hide things. And the life that James and Rebecca presented to the world was beginning to fray at the edges. Small things began to shift. James started arriving at work earlier and staying later, even though his workload hadn't increased. He began marking papers during lunch instead of eating in the teacher's lounge, and when asked if everything was okay at home, he would simply nod. Rebecca, too, had grown more distant. Her usual warmth had cooled. At the clinic, she was still professional, still capable, but noticeably quieter. She declined invitations to happy hour. She missed a few shifts, citing illness. One co-worker later said she'd caught Rebecca standing in the supply closet, staring blankly at the wall, as if she was somewhere far away. Financially, things had taken a turn as well. James had taken out a personal loan to cover the remainder of their kitchen renovation the year before, but credit card bills had started to pile up. A few late notices appeared in the mailbox. Rebecca told a friend she was worried about money, but when asked if she'd talked to James about it, she changed the subject. James, for his part, had always been careful with their finances. Something didn't add up, but he didn't press her. Then there were the phone calls. James had noticed them during dinner, the screen of Rebecca's phone lighting up, only for her to silence it quickly or flip it over. He never asked who it was. Maybe he didn't want to know, but he began to suspect. A gut feeling, a quiet intuition that something wasn't right. She started coming home later than usual, saying she'd picked up extra shifts. She always had an explanation, always a reason. James wanted to believe her. But doubt crept in, slow and suffocating. The distance between them, once a crack, was now a canyon. James still tried. He still bought her flowers on the way home from work. He still left notes in her lunchbox. But the smiles she returned didn't reach her eyes. She seemed distracted, preoccupied. She'd forget things, dinner plans, errands, birthdays. And she'd flinch when James reached for her hand, as if his touch burned her skin. By February, James had started keeping a journal. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a small leather notebook he tucked into his desk drawer. He wrote short entries, mostly about his day, about how Rebecca had looked sad again, how Max seemed restless, how the house felt colder even with the heat on. He wondered if it was just a phase, if they were just going through a rough patch. He still loved her. That part never changed. He just didn't know how to reach her anymore. Then one day in early March, James stopped by the florist on his way home. It was a gray, rainy afternoon. The florist, a cheerful woman in her 60s, remembered him clearly. He asked for red tulips, specifically 12 of them, and he wanted them wrapped in brown paper, tied with a ribbon. He said it was their anniversary, even though it wasn't. He said he just wanted to make her smile again. He paid in cash and left with the bouquet, climbing into his car with a hopeful expression. That night, James never showed up to dinner. He never answered his phone. He never came back to school the next day. And within 24 hours, the quiet house on Maplewood Lane would become the center of a police investigation that would shock the entire neighborhood. No one had seen it coming. Not the teachers, not the nurses, not the neighbors who waved at them every morning. No one could have imagined what really went on behind those walls. The truth was buried under layers of routine, kindness, and silence. But it was about to rise to the surface. And when it did, it would reveal just how dangerous love could become when it starts to rot in the dark. The days leading up to James Collins's disappearance were filled with subtle warnings, little signs that, at the time, didn't seem like much on their own, but when pieced together later, they formed a chilling pattern. It started with time, hours that didn't make sense, schedules that didn't add up, and explanations that felt just a little too rehearsed. Rebecca had been coming home later and later. She said she was working extra shifts to help with their growing expenses. James wanted to believe her. Their finances had been under strain ever since the kitchen renovation, and Rebecca had always taken pride in pulling her weight. But the hours she claimed didn't match what her work schedule reflected. The urgent care clinic closed at 8. James noticed that she sometimes didn't walk through the door until nearly 10. At first, he said nothing. He didn't want to seem controlling or suspicious. But he started watching the clock more closely. He listened to her footsteps when she came in, quiet, careful, as if she didn't want to wake him, even though he was always still awake. He stopped waiting for her in the living room and started waiting from the shadows of their bedroom, pretending to be asleep. He heard her moving around more than necessary, sometimes showering right before bed, sometimes whispering on the phone in the bathroom with the door closed. There were also the nights she didn't come home at all. She told James she was on an overnight shift, covering for a sick colleague. He didn't question it until one night when he decided to stop by the clinic on his way home. He wanted to surprise her with coffee and a sandwich, but when he walked through the glass doors, the receptionist looked confused and told him Rebecca hadn't been on the schedule that evening. James stood there for a moment, unsure what to say, then left quietly, the sandwich still warm in his hand. Something was wrong. He didn't confront her. Instead, he began keeping notes. He checked the car's odometer. He looked through credit, card statements. He noticed a charge for a hotel in downtown Charleston, just a one-night stay. When he asked her about it, she said it was for a friend's bridal shower. But James had never heard of the friend, and when he searched the name online, there was no sign of a wedding. At school, James's behavior started to change. Students said he was distracted, frequently staring out the window or fumbling through lectures he once delivered with ease. He misplaced tests. He forgot meetings. A junior in his calculus class said she noticed a dark bruise on his wrist one afternoon and asked if he was okay. James just smiled and told her not to worry about it. One of his colleagues, a fellow teacher named Brent, grew concerned. They'd been friends for years and often grabbed lunch together. Brent asked him what was going on, but James brushed it off. "Just a rough patch," he said. "Nothing I can't fix." But the cracks were widening. At home, the silence between James and Rebecca was growing louder. Meals were eaten quickly and separately. Their once warm routine, morning coffee, evening TV, shared chores, had vanished. She slept with her back to him. He barely slept at all. One night, James walked into the kitchen and found her phone buzzing on the counter. He picked it up. The name on the screen was C, just the initial. He didn't answer. Instead, he stared at the name, heart pounding. It wasn't a friend or relative. It was someone he didn't know. Someone Rebecca didn't want him to know. That was the night he made a decision. James began to plan a surprise. Something to remind her of the life they had built together, of the love that had once felt effortless. He didn't believe in giving up. He remembered how much she loved tulips, especially red ones, and he remembered the way her face lit up the last time he brought them home. He decided he would do it again. Maybe it was naive. Maybe it was desperate. But James had always believed that love was worth fighting for. On March 14th, James left work early. He told the principal he had a family matter to attend to. He stopped by a small florist a few blocks from the school. The shop owner later described him as polite and soft-spoken. He picked out a dozen red tulips and asked for them to be wrapped simply in brown paper with a red ribbon. He paid in cash and left a small tip. As he walked to his car, it started to drizzle. He didn't seem to notice. James's phone pinged with a text shortly after he got into his car. He glanced at it but didn't respond. Security footage from a nearby gas station caught his vehicle pulling out of the parking lot at 6:34 p.m., heading toward Maplewood Lane. He looked calm, focused. The tulips were on the passenger seat. It was the last known footage of James alive. Rebecca's phone records would later show a brief call made just 15 minutes after James left the florist. She spoke to the contact listed as C for 42 seconds. No one knows what was said. That same night, neighbors reported hearing a single loud noise around 7:15 p.m. One described it as a firework. Another said it sounded like a car backfiring. No one called the police. Rebecca would walk into the police station just before 8:02 the next morning. She looked pale, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, face bare. She told the officer at the desk that her husband had attacked her and that she had defended herself. She said she didn't mean to kill him. She said she was scared. Police arrived at the house minutes later. The living room lights were off. Max, their golden retriever, was locked in the bathroom, whimpering. James lay on the floor in front of the fireplace, the tulips still in his hand. There was a single gunshot wound to the chest, no struggle, no overturned furniture. The scene was strangely quiet, too quiet. Rebecca showed them the handgun, said she had kept it in the nightstand for protection. She claimed James had tried to hit her, that she had feared for her life. But something didn't sit right with the officers. The position of the body, the calm in her voice, the lack of any visible injuries on her, and most of all, the tulips. James had come home with flowers, a peace offering, a gesture of love. Yet now he was dead on the living room floor. Within hours, detectives began to ask questions, and soon the story Rebecca told would begin to unravel, thread by thread, revealing a truth no one could have imagined. The morning after James Collins' death. The Collins house on Maplewood Lane was quiet, the kind of quiet that lingers too long and carries weight. The yellow tape stretched across the front steps didn't belong in a neighborhood like this. Quiet, suburban, predictable. But now, the house that once smelled of fresh coffee and cinnamon candles had become a crime scene. Rebecca arrived at the police station just before 8 o'clock, her face pale, her voice low but steady. She told the officer on duty that her husband had attacked her and that she had been forced to defend herself. She said she was terrified, that it had all happened so fast. She explained that James had become violent, unpredictable, and that things had been escalating for months. She said she didn't know what else to do. When officers entered the home, they found James lying on his back in the center of the living room. His body was partially turned, one arm outstretched, and in that hand he still clutched a bouquet of red tulips. The paper wrap was soaked in blood. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken furniture, no shattered glass, no scattered belongings. A single gunshot wound to the chest. It had pierced his heart. Death had been almost immediate. The handgun, a compact 9mm, was found on the floor near the edge of the couch. It was clean, recently fired, and registered in Rebecca's name. She told the detectives she kept it for protection, locked away in the bedroom nightstand. She said she had never used it before, that she hoped she never would, but nothing about the scene made sense. James had no defensive wounds. There were no marks on Rebecca, no bruises, scratches, or torn clothing. She didn't look shaken or panicked. She looked calm, controlled, like someone who had already prepared for what she was going to say. Officers noted that even her tone lacked urgency. There were no tears. She consented to questioning that same morning. She repeated her story. James had become emotionally distant. He had been under stress. They had been arguing more often. That night, she claimed he came home angry, accusing her of cheating. She said he lunged at her, grabbed her wrist, and shouted. That's when she said she ran to the bedroom, unlocked the nightstand, grabbed the gun, and turned back to find him coming at her again. She said she fired without thinking, one shot. She watched him fall. But detectives found discrepancies in her timeline. The wound on James's chest showed he had been facing her, not advancing, and the angle suggested he had been standing still. There were no fingerprints on the gun except for hers, none on the safe where it had been supposedly stored, and the gun hadn't been inside a locked case. It had been sitting on the coffee table when police arrived, wiped down but not fully. Clean. They asked about James's behavior. Rebecca hesitated, then claimed there had been past incidents, arguments that turned physical. When asked for details, she became vague. No one, not friends, family, or co-workers, had ever heard her mention abuse. There were no records of domestic Disturbance calls, no doctor visits, no photos, no texts, no journal entries, no neighbors who'd heard anything. James had no history of violence, not even a traffic violation. While Rebecca was being interviewed, detectives obtained warrants for the couple's phone records and financial information. Within a few hours, a clearer picture began to emerge. James's phone revealed no signs of an aggressive or unstable man. Instead, there were entries from a personal journal app, quiet reflections about the growing distance in his marriage, worries about Rebecca's late nights, and his hope that things could still be repaired. Rebecca's phone told a different story. There were hundreds of messages between Rebecca and a man named Caleb Ross. Most had been deleted but were recovered through digital forensics. The earliest texts dated back 6 months. They had first met during the kitchen renovation in Neri. The fall, Caleb had been one of the contractors. What began as casual messages about the project had gradually turned into flirtation, then emotional intimacy, and then plans made in secret. Photos exchanged between them showed Rebecca smiling in unfamiliar places, hotel rooms, restaurants, even a secluded hiking trail in North Carolina. Caleb was in many of them, his arm around her shoulders, his hand resting on her thigh. The two had even taken a weekend trip to Asheville under false names. The receipts were tucked into Rebecca's email archive, hidden in a folder labeled medical receipts. It wasn't just an affair. It was a life she was building without James. In one of the texts, sent just 3 weeks before the shooting, Rebecca wrote, "I can't take it anymore. I feel trapped." Caleb replied, "You don't have to stay stuck. You know what needs to happen." And then, just hours before James was shot, a final message from Caleb. "Do it tonight. It's time." Detectives located Caleb that evening. He was living in a rented apartment across town. When brought in for questioning, he denied everything. He claimed he hadn't spoken to Rebecca in over a month and insisted their relationship had ended. He admitted they had been romantically involved, but said he had backed off when she became too intense. He looked nervous, but his story was consistent. Still, police found troubling signs in his background. Caleb had a prior arrest for domestic assault from 5 years earlier. He had been accused of attacking a former girlfriend during a heated argument. The case was dropped due to lack of evidence, but the pattern was unsettling. Despite the suggestive messages and timing, there was no proof that Caleb had been at the Collins house that night. No fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no video surveillance. Without direct involvement, he couldn't be charged. But his influence was undeniable. Back at the house, forensic teams continued searching for anything that would support Rebecca's story of self-defense. They found none. What they did find was a sticky note in James's desk drawer. On it, he had scribbled a short line in his careful handwriting. "I think she's hiding something, but I still love her." The discovery struck investigators hard. This wasn't a man plotting harm. This was a man trying to hold on, trying to fix something he didn't know was already broken beyond repair. The case against Rebecca shifted swiftly. The narrative of a frightened wife defending herself no longer fit the evidence. What once looked like a domestic tragedy was now beginning to look like something else entirely. Premeditation. Prosecutors began building a case not just on physical evidence, but on intent, motive, and deception. A woman who felt stuck, a lover who wanted freedom, a man who came home with flowers and never imagined the door he walked through would be the last one. The quiet street of Maplewood Lane would never be the same. Neighbors left flowers on the porch in the days that followed, unsure what to say, unsure how to reconcile the couple they thought they knew with the nightmare that had unfolded behind closed doors. James was gone. Rebecca was under arrest, and the truth, layered and chilling, was only just beginning to come to light. The trial of Rebecca Collins began 6 months after the shooting, and from the moment it started, the courtroom buzzed with quiet intensity. The small town of Ashbridge hadn't seen a case like this in years. A well-known teacher found dead in his own home, a devoted wife turned suspect, an affair, a gun, and a bouquet of tulips. It had all the ingredients of a tragic mystery. And now, everyone was desperate to understand what had really happened. The prosecution painted a vivid picture. They argued that this was not a crime of passion, but a cold, calculated act. Rebecca, they claimed, wanted out of her marriage without the mess of divorce. She had built a secret life with another man, one where James didn't exist. She had the motive, the means, and the opportunity. And on the night of March 14th, she made a decision: eliminate James and walk away free. They presented the timeline: James buying flowers, captured on a gas station camera just 30 minutes before his death. The bouquet was still in his hand when police arrived. The house showed no signs of a struggle. The gun had been wiped clean. Rebecca had no visible injuries, no torn clothing, no bruises or cuts. Nothing that supported her claim of a violent confrontation. Text messages between Rebecca and Caleb Ross became central to the case. Recovered from her phone, they showed a growing closeness, a shared frustration, and finally, a plan. Do it. Tonight, Caleb had written the night James died. It's time. The jury saw dozens of messages, coded, vague, but undeniably suspicious. The prosecution argued that Caleb didn't need to be there to be involved. He was the push behind Rebecca's final act. The two of them wanted a life together without James in the way. And Rebecca, knowing she had the weapon and the story to cover it, pulled the trigger. The defense took a different approach. They acknowledged the affair. There was no denying it. But they insisted that the relationship with Caleb was a symptom of a failing marriage, not the cause of murder. They painted Rebecca as a woman trapped in a deteriorating relationship with a man whose behavior had become increasingly unpredictable. They pointed to her confession. Rebecca had walked into the police station voluntarily. She hadn't fled. She hadn't tried to hide the weapon or cover up the death. She had been honest, they argued, from the beginning. She told them James had become controlling, paranoid, and in her words, scary. She said she feared for her safety that night, that she had no choice but to defend herself. Her lawyers argued that emotional abuse leaves no physical marks. They brought in a psychologist who described the cycle of manipulation, fear, and helplessness often present in toxic relationships. While there was no official record of abuse, they argued that Rebecca had lived in quiet fear, too ashamed or too scared to tell anyone. But the evidence contradicted that image. Friends and co-workers of James testified that he was kind, soft-spoken, patient. Not a single person reported seeing him lose his temper. There were no complaints, no signs of emotional instability. One of his students even read a journal entry James had written for a school mentorship program. "I love my wife. I just don't know how to make her happy anymore. I think she's slipping away, and I don't know how to stop it." Rebecca sat still as the entry was read aloud. She didn't cry, she didn't speak. Her expression remained unchanged. Then came the biggest twist of the trial. Midway through proceedings, a new piece of evidence emerged. A surveillance camera from a neighbor's home had captured partial footage from the night of the murder. Initially overlooked, the camera had a limited range, pointed toward the street. But forensic analysts enhanced the footage, and at 7:12 p.m., just minutes before the reported time of death, a dark SUV was seen pulling away from the Collins driveway. The vehicle matched the description of Caleb Ross's car. Investigators re-examined Caleb's alibi. He had claimed to be home alone all evening, but he had no receipts, no phone calls, no activity logged on his devices. When questioned again, he insisted he hadn't been near Maplewood Lane, but now the footage suggested otherwise. It wasn't proof that he had entered the house, but it placed him at the scene, close enough to raise serious doubts. The prosecution moved quickly, filing a motion to recall Caleb to the stand. He appeared nervous, more guarded this time. When confronted with the footage, he hesitated before answering. He admitted it was his vehicle, but claimed he had only driven by. He said he'd changed his mind about seeing Rebecca, deciding it wasn't a good idea to get involved. The jury wasn't convinced. Though there wasn't enough to charge Caleb as an accomplice, his shifting story damaged his credibility and, by association, Rebecca's. The image of a woman acting alone began to dissolve. Now, the possibility of a shared plan, or at least a shared motive, seemed more likely. After nearly 3 weeks of testimony, the trial drew to a close. Both sides delivered powerful closing arguments. The prosecution reminded the jury of the careful planning, the affair, the opportunity, and the calm demeanor Rebecca showed after James's death. They asked the jury to consider the tulips, the symbol of peace James had brought home, and how they ended up soaked in his blood. The defense appealed to emotion. They reminded jurors that nobody truly knows what happens inside a marriage. They described Rebecca as a woman who had broken under pressure, made a terrible mistake, but didn't deserve to be labeled a killer. When the jury went into deliberation, the courtroom emptied in silence. Outside, reporters waited, neighbors whispered, and the Collins family remained divided. The jury deliberated for 2 full days. On the third afternoon, they returned with a verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom remained still. Rebecca didn't move. She didn't cry or gasp. She simply lowered her head as the sentence was read: 25 years in prison, eligible for parole after 15. Caleb Ross was never charged. Though investigators continued to examine his involvement, nothing conclusive was found to link him directly to the murder. He left town shortly after the trial ended and hasn't been seen in Ashbridge since. The Collins house was put up for sale within the year. The tulip garden James had planted in the front yard was never tended to again. The petals bloomed red the following spring, scattered and bright beneath the soft wind, but no one was left to care for them. James Collins was remembered by his students as a kind and patient teacher. A scholarship was created in his name, awarded to seniors pursuing careers in education. His former classroom was painted, his desk left empty for weeks before the school brought in a replacement, and Rebecca, she became a cautionary tale in the town's quiet corners. A reminder that behind closed doors, even the most familiar faces can hide unthinkable truths. Years passed, but the story of James and Rebecca Collins never truly faded from the collective memory of Ashbridge. It lingered in the way people spoke about relationships behind closed doors, in quiet glances exchanged during PTA meetings, and in the unease that accompanied the mere mention of their old house on Maplewood Lane. Even as new families moved in, repainting walls and replanting gardens, the shadow of what had occurred there never quite disappeared. Rebecca served her sentence at the Midvale Correctional Facility for Women. Life inside was slow, measured by routines and monitored by schedules. Days blurred into weeks, and weeks into years. At first, she kept to herself, declining interviews and refusing visits. Even her family, once supportive, grew distant. Letters stopped arriving. Her parents moved out of state. Her former friends stayed silent. Over time, Rebecca faded from the public eye, remembered more as a name in a headline than a real person. Inside the prison, however, she was very much real. Her story had followed her there. Some inmates treated her with a cold respect, others with quiet suspicion. No one fully believed the version she had clung to in court. There were whispers about the affair, about the text messages, about the calmness she showed after James's death. Some said she was manipulative. Others believed she had simply snapped. But no one claimed she was innocent. The parole board reviewed her case for the first time after 15 years. By then, she had completed rehabilitation programs, earned a degree through a prison education initiative, and taught literacy classes to fellow inmates. On paper, she was a model prisoner. But when asked again about that night, about what had really happened, Rebecca still gave the same answer. She had been afraid. She had pulled the trigger to survive. The board found her behavior exemplary, but her lack of remorse, or rather her unwavering narrative, worked against her. Her application was denied. Meanwhile, outside prison walls, James's memory endured in quiet, meaningful ways. The scholarship in his name helped dozens of students attend college. A bench with his name engraved on a plaque was placed under the oak tree behind Ashbridge High School, where he had often spent his lunch breaks. Every spring, students planted tulips near the entrance to the school, a tradition started by his former colleagues. But the peace of time was eventually disrupted when a local true crime podcast released a series revisiting the case. The host, a former journalist named Lena Miles, had grown up in Ashbridge and remembered the story vividly. She had always felt something about it didn't sit right. The more she researched, the more questions she uncovered about the investigation, about the overlooked evidence, and especially about Caleb Ross. Lena's series quickly gained traction. With each episode, more listeners tuned in. She interviewed James's former co-workers, classmates, and neighbors. She reviewed court transcripts, police records, and digital archives. The most startling revelation came in episode 4, when she uncovered new security footage from a nearby traffic camera. Footage that showed Caleb's SUV parked on a side street less than a block from the Collins house on the night of the murder, for nearly 40 minutes. This footage had never been presented in court. It had been logged by police but dismissed as inconclusive. Lena sent the footage to independent analysts, who confirmed the timestamp and location. While it still didn't prove Caleb had entered the house, it confirmed beyond doubt that he had been much closer and stayed much longer than he originally claimed. Encouraged by the attention, a group of legal advocates who specialized in wrongful convictions began reviewing Rebecca's case. Though she had admitted to pulling the trigger, the team focused on whether she had acted alone or under pressure. They argued that the initial investigation had rushed to judgment, focusing solely on Rebecca while overlooking Caleb's potential. Involvement. The advocates filed a motion for post-conviction relief, citing new evidence and the possibility of coercion. They didn't argue that Rebecca was innocent, but rather that the full context of the crime had never been properly understood. They suggested that Caleb may have manipulated or pressured Rebecca, or even been physically present during the shooting. The motion reopened old wounds. James's family opposed it, stating that any effort to shift blame dishonored his memory. Still, the court agreed to review the case. Rebecca was brought back for questioning. For the first time, she appeared different, older, quieter, and more withdrawn. Her once confident answers gave way to long pauses and hesitant responses. Then came the unexpected twist. A former cellmate of Rebecca's came forward, claiming Rebecca had confessed to more than she had shared in court. According to her, Rebecca had said Caleb was there that night, that he had come in through the back door while James was in the kitchen, that he hadn't told Rebecca what to do, but made it clear that it was the only way they could be free. She had said she didn't want to do it, but felt like she had to. The woman's testimony was shaky. She admitted that she and Rebecca had had a falling out, but the story added a new layer of possibility, one that raised enough doubt to warrant further review. Caleb was located living in Florida, running a small construction business under a new name. When contacted by authorities, he denied any involvement. He refused to speak publicly. But the heat around him was rising again. In a final twist, a sealed envelope was found in a safe deposit box belonging to James, discovered by his sister when she was closing out his estate. Inside was a handwritten letter. It was undated, but clearly written not long before his death. In it, James described his suspicions. He believed Rebecca was hiding something. He had noticed the way she looked at her phone when she thought he wasn't watching. The letter ended with a chilling line. "If anything ever happens to me, please know I was trying. I never stopped trying." The letter wasn't a confession, nor did it name anyone. But it confirmed what many had already believed. James knew something was wrong. And yet, he stayed. He brought flowers. He believed, somehow, that love could fix what had already fallen apart. The court ultimately denied the motion for post-conviction. Relief. There was too much speculation and not enough proof. Caleb remained a person of interest, but no charges were ever filed against him. Rebecca's sentence stood. She remains incarcerated, though she is eligible for parole again in 3 years. The town of Ashbridge moved forward, but the legacy of that night continues to echo. Some believe justice was served. Others believe it was only half delivered. In the end, James Collins became more than a victim. He became a symbol of love's blind hope and the devastating cost of betrayal. Rebecca, once seen as a loving wife, became something far more complicated. And Caleb Ross, the shadowy figure in the background, disappeared into obscurity, never held accountable, but never fully cleared. It began with flowers. It ended with a gun. And in between, a truth so tangled that even time couldn't unravel it completely.